Vasco da Gama was born around 1460 in the coastal town of Sines, a wind-swept settlement on the western edge of Portugal, where the Atlantic horizon inspired both fear and fascination. Sines was not a grand city, but a frontier against the unknown. Its people lived by the rhythm of tides, by the fortunes of fishing boats, and by hopes tied to distant waters. Salt air, crashing surf, and the sight of foreign sails were constants of his childhood. Here, the sea was not a boundary, but a promise. Into this world, Vasco da Gama entered, unaware that one day he would reshape the map of global trade and redraw the line between continents. His family belonged neither to the highest nobility nor to humble fishermen's ranks. Vasco's father, Estevão da Gama, was a minor nobleman connected to the military orders that defended Portugal's coastline and participated in the early phases of Atlantic exploration. His mother, Isabel Sodré, descended from a family of English roots, tied to seafaring tradition and navigation. These ancestral lines, military discipline on one side, maritime experience on the other, formed the dual inheritance that would later guide Vasco toward exploration. The Gama household held status, yet lived close enough to the ocean that the smell of tar and fish mingled with the sounds of sword practice and political conversation. Childhood in Sines exposed Vasco to the expanding ambitions of Portugal. Fishermen spoke of storms and unseen islands. Merchants whispered of spices carried from the east by Arab traders, and royal envoys passed along the road toward Lisbon to discuss new voyages commissioned by Prince Henry's successors. Vasco grew up hearing of caravels returning from North Africa, of gold from Guinea, and of voyages pushing further down the African coastline. The boy who played beneath fortress walls and watched sailors unload their cargo would one day lead an expedition beyond any voyage Portugal had yet attempted. The Gama family's status opened doors to education in mathematics, navigation, and weaponry, but it was the environment that shaped his spirit. Sines offered constant exposure to sailors hardened by storms, to maps drawn with guesswork and hope, and to stories of lands beyond the equator where spices grew like treasure. Vasco da Gama's birth was not marked by prophecy, and yet the world that formed him, half noble court, half ocean wind, prepared him for destiny. His roots were neither entirely land-bound nor fully maritime, but balanced between the two. In time, this balance would allow him to stand at the helm of a fleet bound for India, carrying with him the legacy of a town that stared endlessly into the sea and dreamed of what lay beyond the horizon. Vasco da Gama's path toward exploration was paved not only by geography and family heritage, but by the education he received as a young nobleman in a kingdom obsessed with the sea. Portugal, in the late 15th century, was a laboratory of discovery. Its schools and royal courts trained young men to read stars the way others read scripture. Da Gama learned navigation as a discipline of patience and geometry, where every calculation meant safety and every misjudged angle spelled danger on open water. He studied charts drawn from earlier voyages, instruments inherited from Arab sailors, and the mathematics that turned uncertain oceans into measurable routes. Knowledge, not luck, would one day carry him beyond the familiar Atlantic and into the uncharted waters of the Indian Ocean. Astronomy became one of the most essential pillars of his training. Portuguese navigators relied on the heavens as their compass, the North Star for direction, the movement of the sun for time and latitude, and celestial patterns to chart unknown coasts. Da Gama learned to hold an astrolabe steady against the pitch of a ship, to read the arc of the sun above the mast, and to convert angles into position with accuracy that could not tolerate error. Nights spent beneath the stars formed a silent apprenticeship. No classroom needed, only the sky itself. In an age before reliable maps, astronomy was navigation's heartbeat, and Vasco da Gama learned to listen to it. Mathematics provided the language of the sea. Multiplication, fractions, and trigonometry were not abstract concepts. They were tools for survival. Da Gama studied how to calculate distance based on speed and time, how to measure wind by sail tension, and how to estimate longitude long before instruments existed to measure it directly. In this era, every expedition was a gamble, but mathematics reduced uncertainty, turning the ocean from mystery into a vast but knowable system. Through this training, Vasco learned that a voyage required discipline as much as courage. Numbers could guide a ship across the world if a commander trusted their truth. This education, blending science, seafaring tradition, and royal ambition, prepared Vasco da Gama for a mission far greater than any Portugal had yet attempted. While others before him had sailed toward Africa, he absorbed the knowledge required to push past its shores and continue eastward into waters known only through rumor and spice trade whispers. He was shaped not merely by inheritance or curiosity, but by calculation, celestial study, and technical precision. When his moment arrived, he would not step into uncharted seas as a dreamer alone, but as a navigator trained by stars, numbers, and the restless ambition of a nation determined to reach India. His education transformed possibility into route, horizon into doorway, a foundation without which history might never have known his name. Before Vasco da Gama ever faced the unknown waters beyond Africa, he earned his sea legs along the rugged Portuguese coast, a shoreline of shifting winds, hidden shoals, and relentless Atlantic swells. As a young man, he joined expeditions between Setúbal, Algarve, and the Madeira Islands, learning the rhythms of tide and current as intimately as another might learn scripture. These early voyages taught him that seamanship was not a gift granted by birth, but a craft shaped by salt, wind, and repetition. He learned when a sail must be tightened, when the helm must be corrected, and how a captain must listen to the ocean as though it were a living mind with moods that could bless or destroy. Along this coastline, da Gama trained beneath veteran commanders who had weathered tempests and battled pirates who lurked in Atlantic waters. He watched officers gauge storms by cloud shape alone, and navigators take the measure of winds without instruments. The ship was his classroom. The creak of timber, the snap of canvas, the steady beat of waves against hull. Storms tested him more than tutors did. He learned to hold command under pressure, not with loud authority, but with calm instruction. The coast of Portugal was a proving ground, and da Gama proved patient, durable, confident in decisions formed through observation rather than fear. These voyages also exposed him to Portugal's maritime ambition. Each port held news of expeditions rounding Cape Boador or sailing toward Guinea. The ship's deck became a map of empire, loaded with wine and wool outbound, returning with gold dust, ivory, and tales of coasts farther south. Da Gama witnessed firsthand that the sea was no longer merely a border, but the artery of Portuguese expansion. With every journey, he understood more clearly that exploration was not a dream of individuals, but a national strategy woven from trade, faith, and a hunger for spices that lay beyond the horizon. To sail was to serve the kingdom's future. By the time Vasco da Gama reached adulthood, he was no stranger to hardship at sea. He had navigated fog so thick it erased the world to a ghostly gray, endured winter storms that tore rigging like thread, and seen men fear the dark line where ocean met sky. Yet he returned to sea again and again, not out of duty alone, but out of conviction that the water held paths not yet written on any map. His early naval experience did more than strengthen his skill. It shaped his resolve. It taught him that courage is not the absence of uncertainty, but the willingness to sail despite it. When the crown later called upon him to command a fleet to India, Vasco da Gama stepped forward, not as a novice, but as a mariner already tempered by wind, tide, and an Atlantic that had tested and prepared him for history. By the final decade of the 15th century, Portugal stood on the brink of a maritime breakthrough. Mariners had traced the West African coastline, Bartolomeu Dias had reached and rounded the Cape of Good Hope, and trade winds were no longer secrets but tools. What Portugal needed next was not another coastal voyage, but a commander capable of pushing beyond Africa and sailing into the Indian Ocean, toward the spice kingdoms whose wealth had tempted Europe for generations. It was in this moment of global anticipation that King Manuel I turned his attention to Vasco da Gama. Da Gama's mix of nobility, discipline, and proven seamanship made him a remarkable candidate for a mission unlike any the kingdom had ever attempted. His selection was not accidental, nor merely ceremonial. King Manuel required a leader with strategic patience, the ability to command crews for years at sea, and the intellect to navigate waters no European had entered with certainty. Da Gama possessed these traits, sharpened by education in astronomy and cartography, but also hardened by storms and coastal piloting. He had demonstrated reliability in previous expeditions and had connections to naval circles through his father, who had once been considered for a similar voyage. When the king sought someone capable of turning possibility into route, Vasco da Gama's name surfaced repeatedly, not as the loudest figure, but as the most prepared. Portugal's royal court buzzed with debate as the expedition took shape. Ministers, merchants, and navigators understood that this was no ordinary voyage. To reach India was to alter the flow of global commerce, to break the Muslim trade networks that controlled spice distribution, and to place Portugal at the center of world exchange. The fleet's construction was carefully overseen, stocked with astronomers, interpreters, priests, craftsmen, and armed soldiers. Maps were rechecked, stars charted, negotiations drafted for distant rulers no one had yet met. At the center of this monumental planning stood Vasco da Gama, still young but steady, carrying on his shoulders the ambitions of a nation and the burden of uncharted ocean. When King Manuel I officially entrusted him with command in 1497, da Gama accepted not as a man seeking glory, but as one who understood the weight of the unknown. He prepared 4 ships, the São Gabriel, São Rafael, Berrio, and a supply vessel, each outfitted with instruments refined in Portugal's schools and courage gathered from decades of exploration. As the fleet anchored in Lisbon harbor, sails furled and waiting, the moment felt like history holding its breath. Vasco da Gama had been chosen to do what no European captain had yet achieved, to connect 2 worlds by crossing the vast ocean between them. His selection marked the beginning of a voyage that would change maps, economies, and the shape of empires. The horizon before him was wide and uncertain, but he stepped toward it with the confidence of a mariner who had spent a lifetime preparing for that single departure. As the summer of 1497 approached, Lisbon transformed into a hive of urgency around Vasco da Gama's expedition. The docks rang with the thud of barrels being rolled into holds, the clatter of iron nails securing timber, and the smell of pitch-sealing ships against the Atlantic's violence. 4 vessels, the São Gabriel, São Rafael, the Berrio, and a supply carrack, lay anchored like patient beasts awaiting release. Astronomical instruments were packed alongside artillery. Charts, some no better than sketches of coasts, were rolled and stored beside rosaries and prayer books. The preparation reflected 2 worlds at once: the scientific ambition of a nation trained in navigation, and the spiritual hope that God would guide them beyond the known world. Every crate loaded, every compass polished, carried the weight of a kingdom's future. Crew selection was as critical as shipbuilding. The men chosen were not inexperienced dreamers, but hardened sailors familiar with storms, hunger, and mutiny. There were navigators skilled in reading stars, carpenters capable of repairing ribs and masts mid-ocean, priests to give sacraments, interpreters who spoke fragments of Arabic or Swahili, and soldiers who understood that trade routes could be won by negotiation or by cannon. Supplies were measured for years, not months. Salted meat, dried biscuits, wine casks, beans, olive oil, medical herbs, and even livestock. The fleet prepared for everything: starvation, disease, trade, diplomacy, and war. Behind every sealed barrel lay the knowledge that failure meant silence on the ocean floor. The days before departure carried both ceremony and tension. Lisbon citizens gathered along the waterfront, whispering about the dangers ahead, the rolling fury of the southern seas, the unknown scope of the Indian Ocean, the stories of monsters said to swim beyond the Cape. Yet hope outweighed fear. Portugal had spent nearly a century pushing down the African coastline. Now, with Vasco da Gama, the journey would leap beyond its furthest boundary. King Manuel I attended solemn mass with the commander, asking divine favor for a voyage intended to break the centuries-old Muslim control of spice trade. Bells rang across churches, sails snapped like wings ready to take flight, and at dawn, incense and salt wind mixed in the harbor air as if blessing and ocean had become one. On July 8, 1497, the ships finally slipped from Lisbon's embrace. Drums beat, oars pulled to guide the fleet into open water, and families stood on the shore as white sails caught the rising wind. The Tagus River narrowed behind them until land dissolved into memory, replaced by the endless blue horizon ahead. Vasco da Gama stood on deck, not as a man departing home, but as one stepping into world history. Behind him lay Europe, before him lay mystery. The departure was more than a voyage. It was a hinge in time. Lisbon had sent its fleet not to follow known paths, but to create a new one. As the coastline faded, the men aboard knew that they sailed into uncertainty with a single promise: that if they succeeded, the world would never remain the same. After weeks at sea, the coast of Africa stretched long and relentless beside Vasco da Gama's fleet, first familiar, then gradually wild and unknown. The ships replenished briefly at the Cape Verde Islands before venturing south into waters where European charts grew thin and guesses filled the margins of maps. As the journey continued, winds shifted with a temper that could not be read by memory alone. Storms gathered without warning, whipping sails until masts groaned like living creatures under strain. Each morning the crew scanned the horizon not for land, but for mercy. Cloud breaks, clean skies, a sign that the ocean would allow progress. Every degree of latitude earned was paid for with hunger, exhaustion, and the creak of planks swollen with salt and fear. The turning point came as they approached the Cape of Good Hope, known to earlier sailors as the Cape of Storms, and feared as the southern gate of the world. There, where Atlantic and Indian waters collided, waves rose like mountains, and winds twisted without pattern. Two oceans fought like opposing empires, and the ships caught in between had to endure or be broken. Da Gama ordered rigging shortened, men tethered to rails, and cargo secured against the violent pitch of the sea. Days passed under gray sky and furious water. Nights were darker still, lit only by crash of white foam and shouts drowned in wind. Yet through this brutal test, Da Gama remained steady, commanding not with panic, but with measured decisions carved from his years of coastal experience. The Cape demanded skill, patience, and nerve, and he answered with all three. When the storm finally loosened its grip, the fleet rounded the Cape, emerging into calmer waters like survivors stepping through a threshold. The ocean changed character. The sky cleared, currents warmed, and unfamiliar constellations glimmered overhead. It was the Indian Ocean, the vast waterway that for centuries had belonged to Arab and East African traders alone. For the first time in European history, a fleet had passed beyond the natural barrier that had shaped continents and commerce. The crew looked upon a sea untouched by European sails, knowing that every nautical mile forward was history unfolding beneath their keel. No returning chronicler would speak of this moment lightly. From there, they traced the African coastline northward, stopping in places like Mozambique and Mombasa, where trade networks, languages, and beliefs were unlike anything European sailors had known. Encounters varied. Some ports welcomed the Portuguese with curiosity, others with caution or hostility, wary of newcomers whose ambitions stretched beyond simple exchange. Yet the greatest struggle had already been won. They had crossed the line the world once believed uncrossable. The rounding of the Cape of Good Hope was more than a navigational feat. It was a breach in the walls of geography, a moment where courage and calculation overcame myth and sea. From that point onward, the Indian Ocean was no longer distant imagination. Vasco da Gama had proven that wind, mathematics, and persistence could carry Europe to the threshold of Asia, and a new age of global connection had begun, one wave at a time. In May 1498, after months of hardship and uncertainty across oceans no European had previously mastered, Vasco da Gama's fleet anchored off the Malabar coast near Calicut, gateway to the wealth of the Indian Ocean. The city shimmered in heat and color, its harbor alive with vessels from Arabia, Africa, Persia, and the Malay world. The Portuguese sailors stared at ships shaped unlike any they knew, laden with pepper, cinnamon, jewels, silk, and porcelain. Towering palms framed the coastline. The smell of spice hung in the air like wealth made visible. They had reached not rumor, but reality. India, home of markets richer than any Lisbon had ever seen. Their voyage was no longer an experiment. It had become entry into an ancient commercial world. Da Gama's first mission was not battle, but diplomacy. Guided by local fishermen and accompanied by intermediaries who spoke Arabic, he approached Calicut's ruler, the Zamorin, carrying gifts meant to impress: striped cloth, coral, hats, and silver coins. Yet these offerings, impressive by European standards, seemed almost trivial in a city accustomed to gold, pearls, and fine Chinese goods. The Zamorin received da Gama courteously, but with cool curiosity. To Calicut, Portugal was not yet a power, merely a stranger on the horizon. Still, dialogue began. Da Gama sought trade privileges and Christian alliances. His hosts viewed him as an ambitious merchant, among many who crossed the Indian Ocean each monsoon season. The city's bazaar offered da Gama a glimpse into the scale of Eastern commerce. Rows of merchants bargained in multiple languages: Arabic, Tamil, Gujarati. Ledgers and weights determined value more accurately than any king's decree. Spices were measured like treasure, pepper mounded in dark heaps, cinnamon bundled in fragrant coils, ginger and cardamom stacked in woven baskets. The Portuguese learned how trade moved through a network far older and more efficient than anything in Europe. Goods flowed from Southeast Asia and Africa, reaching Calicut before traveling west toward Cairo and Venice. For centuries, Europe had received these spices at the end of a long chain. Now, the Portuguese stood at its beginning. Yet the encounter was not free of tension. Muslim merchants who dominated the spice trade quickly recognized that da Gama's presence threatened established routes and profits. Rumors spread through markets like sparks across dry palm fiber. If Portugal carved its own corridor to Europe, Venice would lose control of spice taxation, Cairo would lose revenue, and Arab traders would lose their role as middlemen. Suspicion mounted. Negotiations stalled. What began as cautious welcome slipped toward rivalry. Still, da Gama had achieved what no sailor before him had accomplished. He opened a sea route to India, bridging worlds separated by myth and distance. When Vasco da Gama eventually departed Calicut, he carried back spices, trade knowledge, and, most importantly, proof that the route to India by sea was real. His arrival marked not merely the end of a voyage, but the beginning of a global shift. Calicut had shown Portugal a world of dazzling wealth and competing power. Europe had stepped onto the stage of the Indian Ocean trade, and nothing in its history, or the world's, would remain the same. Vasco da Gama's landing in Calicut was not greeted with open doors and immediate partnership. The city's ruler, the Zamorin, presided over a thriving, centuries-old trade system that linked East Africa, Arabia, Persia, and the Malay world to the heart of India. Into this delicate network arrived the Portuguese, foreigners without established alliances, without translators fluent in local languages, and most importantly, without goods of equal value to those already circulating through the ports. Their gifts, impressive by European measure, appeared modest in comparison with the silks, gold, and precious stones regularly exchanged along the Malabar coast. Da Gama quickly realized that earning a place in this trade hierarchy would require more than a rival. It demanded negotiation, leverage, and patience. The greatest obstacles emerged not from rulers, but from the merchants who truly controlled the marketplace. Muslim traders, particularly wealthy Arab guilds, dominated spice distribution and viewed da Gama's fleet as a threat. They feared that if the Portuguese succeeded in establishing direct trade with Europe, centuries of profitable middle exchange through the Red Sea and Mediterranean would collapse. Whispered warnings spread through Calicut. These newcomers seek to divert trade, not participate in it. Prices rose unfairly, potential partners hesitated, and caravans refused to sell at reasonable rates. Every move da Gama made felt shadowed by invisible resistance, subtle enough to avoid public conflict, strong enough to neutralize progress. Frustrations deepened as da Gama pressed for a formal trade agreement. The Zamorin remained courteous, yet increasingly non-committal, pressured by advisors who feared the Portuguese could destabilize regional merchants and provoke retaliation from powerful Arabian traders. Da Gama's demands for exclusive rights to spices seemed unrealistic in a port built on free exchange. Negotiations soured further when Portuguese goods were compared, unfavorably, to the luxuries arriving from the East. What Europe considered valuable was already abundant in India. What India prized most, Portugal did not yet possess. Mutual misunderstanding hardened into mistrust. The Portuguese saw themselves as pioneers. Local rulers and traders saw them as newcomers demanding privilege without proving worth. Tensions eventually rose into open hostility. Rival merchants worked to block Portuguese access to pepper and ginger, urged the Zamorin to limit negotiations, and even encouraged sabotage among port officials. Da Gama, lacking allies and surrounded by commercial rivals, resorted to shows of strength, threatening to seize hostages, firing cannons from the fleet, and pressuring the court through force rather than diplomacy. These actions would shape the tone of future Portuguese activity in India. Negotiation paired with intimidation. Trade enforced by naval power. Vasco da Gama left Calicut with only modest cargo, but with a new understanding of the world he had reached. India could not be won by a rival alone. Its markets were ruled by influence, its sea routes by competition, and its wealth protected by centuries of established networks. The challenges he faced in Calicut were the opening struggle in a long conflict for control of the Indian Ocean, a conflict that would soon transform commerce into empire. The return from India proved far more punishing than the outward voyage. Vasco da Gama's fleet left Calicut with knowledge, spices, and diplomatic uncertainty, but also with weakened crews. Months at sea had already taken their toll, and the long passage home would push endurance beyond its limits. Crossing the Indian Ocean westward meant battling contrary winds and storms that tore sails and flooded decks. Scurvy spread quickly among sailors deprived of fresh food, swelling their gums and leaving them too weak to climb rigging or work the pumps. Da Gama stood over charts stained with salt and sweat, knowing that every day lost meant more lives slipping away. He commanded with severity when necessary, tenderness when possible. The ocean demanded both. When the fleet rounded the Cape of Good Hope once more, the ships were ghostly echoes of the vessels that had left Lisbon a year before. The return voyage claimed many men, some buried at sea beneath hurried prayers, others left behind at African ports for treatment they might never receive. Yet da Gama pressed on. Stops along the East African coast brought water and brief relief, and his ships traced again the shoreline that had once led them toward hope. Now it led them home. The Mombasa sun glared white against the deck. Mozambique winds filled patched sails just enough. Every league sailed north along Africa was a victory of endurance rather than discovery. What the expedition lacked in comfort, it compensated in significance. In early September 1499, a battered ship from da Gama's fleet entered the Tagus River, staggering proof that Portugal had reached India and returned alive. The news spread through Lisbon like a spark across dry timber. Bells rang from church towers, merchants rushed to the docks, and the court erupted in celebration. Spices unloaded from the holds, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, filled the harbor with an aroma no European port had ever known. The journey had not been smooth, nor clean, nor cheap in human cost, but it had succeeded. The seas that once seemed endless had become navigable pathways. Vasco da Gama had turned India from rumor into route. King Manuel I rewarded him richly, granting titles, estates, and the fame reserved for men who alter history. Across Europe, da Gama's voyage was spoken of with awe, a journey that proved continents could be linked not by caravans across deserts, but by sails stretching over oceans, Portugal transformed overnight into the new hub of maritime ambition. The return to Lisbon was more than a homecoming. It was the moment an empire began to take shape. Amid celebrations, da Gama stood not only as a captain who survived the impossible, but as the navigator who rewrote the geography of the world. The horizon had opened, and Portugal would never again be satisfied with the shores it once knew. When Vasco da Gama returned to India in 1502, he did not arrive as an emissary seeking trade, but as the commander of a punitive fleet armed with cannon, treaty demands, and the authority of a rising maritime empire. The Portuguese crown, exhilarated by the wealth returned from the first expedition, yet enraged by hostile merchant interference in Calicut, intended to secure dominance over the Indian Ocean by force if diplomacy failed. Da Gama's second voyage consisted of roughly 20 ships, far larger, heavier, and more militarized than the modest fleet that first reached India. Where the earlier mission was uncertain voyage, this one was calculated assertion. Portugal would no longer knock at India's door. It would push it open. The fleet's first objective was to intimidate coastal powers into submission or alliance. Along East Africa, da Gama bombarded cities that resisted and rewarded those that opened harbor to Portuguese trade. In Mozambique and Kilwa, local rulers were compelled to pay tribute. In other ports, da Gama seized hostages as insurance against betrayal. News of this new Portuguese demeanor traveled ahead of the sails like a warning carried on monsoon winds. By the time the fleet crossed into the Indian Ocean proper, Vasco da Gama was no longer received merely as a foreign visitor. He was recognized, feared, as the leading edge of European expansion. Upon reaching Calicut, da Gama sought to avenge the earlier insult to Portuguese commerce and to break the monopoly of Arab Muslim traders who had dominated spice routes for centuries. Negotiations collapsed quickly under the weight of mutual distrust. Violence followed. The Portuguese bombarded the city from the sea, blocked ships entering its harbor, and seized merchant vessels believed to be associated with Calicut's rulers. Goods were confiscated, crews executed, and survivors were sometimes sent back mutilated. A brutal message that Portuguese trade would now be enforced by cannon rather than courtesy. It was a grim pivot in global history. The Indian Ocean, once a corridor of exchange managed by ancient trade networks, entered the age of European conquest. Yet military aggression alone could not create an empire. It needed ports, allies, and protected warehouses. Da Gama turned to Cochin and Cananor, rival coastal powers resentful of Calicut's dominance, and formed the partnerships he could not secure on his first voyage. He left behind factory outposts, stationed armed traders, and laid the foundation for the Estado de India, the Portuguese colonial structure that would rule eastern waters for more than a century. Spices began to flow westward under Portuguese escort, no longer through the Red Sea and Venice, but around Africa and into Lisbon. The balance of global trade shifted like the movement of tides. The second voyage transformed Vasco da Gama from explorer to architect of empire. Where the first journey opened a route, the second defined its purpose: control, profit, and naval supremacy. Portuguese power now stood firmly in the Indian Ocean, not by invitation, but by strategy and force. Da Gama's guns secured what his navigation first revealed. History would remember his first voyage for discovery and his second for domination, together shaping the dawn of Europe's age of empire, and with it, a new world where oceans became the highways of power. After the success and violence of his second expedition, Vasco da Gama stood at the center of a sweeping transformation. the creation of the Estado da India, the Portuguese imperial system that would govern trade and territory from East Africa to the Spice Islands. Da Gama had proven that Portugal could not merely reach India, it could impose itself upon it. The crown sought to convert maritime access into commercial dominance, and da Gama became one of the primary architects of this ambition. The Estado da India was not a single colony or fort, but a network of outposts, harbors, alliances, and naval patrols designed to control the flow of spices and ensure Portuguese supremacy in oceanic trade. The sea itself became the empire, shaped by ships instead of walls. Da Gama's policies emphasized three intertwined pillars: armed presence, commercial leverage, and strategic diplomacy. Under his influence, Portuguese fleets patrolled the Indian Ocean like moving fortresses, intercepting merchant vessels and demanding passes known as cartazus, permits that forced traders to acknowledge Portuguese authority. Taxes were imposed on cargo, agreements were extracted at Cannon Point, and rival Muslim traders, long dominant along the Malabar and Swahili coasts, found themselves challenged by a European empire determined to break centuries-old monopolies. Portuguese fortifications soon rose in Cochin, Cananor, and later Goa, while trading factories stored pepper, cinnamon, and cloves for direct shipment to Lisbon. This was not exploration. It was structure, designed to hold and exploit the route da Gama had opened. The system depended not only on force, but on alliances with rulers willing to defy Calicut. Da Gama encouraged rivalries among Indian kingdoms, rewarding those who accepted Portuguese support and punishing those who resisted. Small ports, long overshadowed by Calicut's trade dominance, found in Portugal an opportunity to rise. In return for protection, they granted warehouse rights, fresh supplies, and monopoly privileges that funneled wealth into Portuguese hands. As the Estado da India expanded, Lisbon grew rich beyond precedent. Spices once trickling through Venice now arrived directly by the shipload. The balance of global commerce shifted from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic, and Portugal moved from small Western kingdom to world power. Da Gama's influence outlived his journeys. The administrative and military model he helped establish became the blueprint for Portuguese rule in Asia for nearly 2 centuries. When he was later appointed Viceroy of India in 1524, it signaled not merely recognition of one navigator, but affirmation of an empire built on his wake. The Estado da India was his legacy, not in parchment alone, but in ports controlled, seas patrolled, and nations reshaped by naval power. Vasco da Gama had changed the map. Now he shaped the system that would govern it. Through him, Europe no longer observed the Indian Ocean from afar. It ruled within it, steering history with the wind in its sails and the echo of cannon across water. With a sea route established and Portuguese ships now a regular presence near the Malabar coast, Vasco da Gama entered a world where commerce was as political as any battlefield. The Indian Ocean was not an empty expanse awaiting European claim. It was a centuries-old marketplace governed by negotiation, ritual, and balance. Arab merchants, Gujarati financiers, Swahili captains, Persian brokers, and Indian court officials formed a web of partnerships that stretched from the Red Sea to Malacca. Into this system, da Gama sailed carrying heavy cannon, Christian ambition, and royal mandates for monopoly. His challenge was immense. Portugal could not simply insert itself into the spice economy. It had to either earn a place or force one. From this difficulty emerged da Gama's defining pattern of rule: diplomacy when useful, violence when necessary. In ports like Cochin and Cananor, Da Gama found rulers willing to engage. These cities, overshadowed by Calicut for generations, saw in Portuguese fleets a means of countering their powerful neighbor. Da Gama capitalized on these rivalries carefully, offering military support in exchange for trading rights, fort sites, and pepper stocks. Markets opened cautiously, guided by interpreters who bridged language gaps word by word. Negotiations took place in palace courtyards scented with sandalwood, where Da Gama listened to court astrologers and emissaries speak of monsoon cycles and caravan routes. Trade agreements were sealed with gifts, feasts, and signed charters, but always under the watchful presence of Portuguese guns anchored off the coast like steel-shadowed guarantees. Diplomacy flowed most easily where it could be backed by the threat of force. Elsewhere, conflict overshadowed negotiation. Calicut, the commercial heart of the Malabar coast, refused to accept Portuguese dominance or the erosion of Muslim merchant privilege. Da Gama's response was uncompromising: blockades, bombardments, and the seizure of ships carrying spices westward. Arab traders, alarmed by European aggression, attempted to unite coastal rulers against the newcomers. For every treaty Da Gama secured, resistance hardened in other harbors. Some ports sent envoys bearing peace terms, others prepared war fleets of their own. Hostility and alliance rose together like twin tides. The Indian Ocean became less a route of exchange than a contested arena where ships served as embassies and battlefields alike. Out of this mixture of conflict and negotiation arose a Portuguese strategy that would redefine oceanic trade. Control the sea, and you control the spice. Da Gama enforced cartas passes for merchant vessels, imposed duties on cargo, and stationed patrol fleets along shipping lanes to intercept any who ignored Portuguese claim. Asian rulers learned that peace brought access to European silver and weaponry, while defiance invited blockade or cannon fire. These negotiations, half treaty, half warning, transformed the Indian Ocean into the first European-dominated maritime empire. Vasco da Gama's role was not merely to explore, but to bend the ocean's political order toward Lisbon. Through conflict where needed and diplomacy where possible, da Gama helped turn the East from trade partner into imperial sphere. Markets that once flowed freely now passed through Portuguese gates, and the seas roared not only with monsoon winds, but with a new voice of maritime power. His negotiations, sometimes patient, sometimes brutal, laid the groundwork for a century in which Portugal commanded the Indian Ocean as firmly as it commanded the horizon. By the early 1520s, Portugal's Eastern Empire had grown vast, but unstable. Governors competed for influence, trade officials enriched themselves, and alliances along the Indian coast shifted as quickly as monsoon winds. The Estado da India required not merely a commander, but a figure whose authority could not be questioned. That responsibility fell to Vasco da Gama, the man who had opened the sea route to India and shaped the empire's foundation through earlier expeditions. His appointment in 1524 as Viceroy of India was both recognition and necessity. Recognition of his service, necessity born of disorder that only a seasoned navigator and hardened administrator might control. He was no longer merely explorer or admiral. He became the king's supreme representative across the Indian Ocean. The decision carried symbolic weight. For nearly 3 decades, Portuguese fleets had sailed beneath routes Da Gama first mapped with courage and bitterness. Now he returned not as voyager, but as ruler, with authority to discipline governors, regulate trade, and restore order to an empire that risked collapsing under its own success. His third voyage to India was marked by a fleet not designed for discovery, but for governance. Ships filled with officials, soldiers, and clerks tasked with reshaping the administration of spice, taxation, and diplomacy. Da Gama embarked with the sober focus of a man who no longer sought horizons, but wished to preserve those he had already reached. Upon arrival in Goa, Da Gama found corruption deeply rooted within the bureaucracy. Traders circumvented royal tariffs, local governors struck private deals with merchants, and the pepper trade leaked profit to those who served themselves rather than the crown. Da Gama began reform with uncompromising force. Officials were removed or imprisoned, revenue tightened, and royal law reinstated where bribery had ruled unchecked. His governance reflected the same resolute discipline that once guided him through storms and hostile ports. He governed not through ceremony but through decisive correction, stern, often feared, but effective. The empire once again felt the hand of its original architect. Yet his time as viceroy was brief, marked by urgency rather than longevity. Months after assuming office, Da Gama fell ill in Cochin, worn by years of hardship and the burden of empire. But in that brief tenure, he accomplished what the crown most needed: restored authority, restructured trade control, and reasserted Portuguese supremacy along the Malabar coast. His appointment as viceroy was the final arc of a life that began with exploration and ended with governance. Vasco da Gama had sailed as pioneer, returned as conqueror, and died as the ruler of the empire he helped create. Through this role, his legacy shifted from navigational triumph to imperial consolidation. Proof that discovery changes history, but leadership determines how that change endures. Vasco da Gama's final journey to India in 1524 was not driven by the spirit of exploration that had defined his youth, but by duty, stern, heavy, and unavoidable. Portugal's eastern dominion, the Estado da India, had expanded rapidly but unevenly. Corruption eroded profits, local governors prioritized personal gain over royal command, and rival powers threatened to reclaim control of maritime trade. King João III knew that only one figure carried enough authority, history, and fear to bring order back to the empire: the man who had opened the route itself. So in his late 60s, carrying decades of salt and battle in his bones, Vasco da Gama boarded a ship once more, bound not for discovery, but for restoration. The voyage was long, yet unlike his first two, it carried a tone of inevitability. Da Gama traveled as viceroy, accompanied by administrators, clerks, and emissaries tasked with rebuilding the imperial structure from within. When he arrived in Goa, he found the situation worse than letters had described. Trade officials diverted taxes into private ports, captains cut unauthorized deals with Arab brokers, and warehouses overflowed with unrecorded spices that never reached Lisbon's treasury. Da Gama responded in the only way he knew, with swift, uncompromising discipline. Corrupt officials were arrested, accounts were re-audited, and new regulations were issued that re-tightened Lisbon's grip on its colonial engine. He was no longer a navigator steering a vessel. He was an imperial surgeon, removing diseased limbs to keep the body alive. But the sea that shaped him had taken its toll. The climate of the Malabar coast, thick with humidity and disease, pressed heavily upon an aging frame already worn by decades at sea. Illness struck shortly after his reforms began, leaving him weak and confined. Even while bedridden, he continued to issue orders, receive reports, and plan the structure of governance he might not live to finish. From his chambers in Cochin, he listened to monsoon winds break against the coast, winds he had once conquered with sails and compass. Now they sounded like an old companion, returning at the end of the journey. In December 1524, Vasco da Gama died in Cochin, far from Lisbon, but surrounded by the empire he forged. His remains would later be returned to Portugal, but his final work remained anchored in India, an administrative foundation strong enough to sustain Portuguese presence for generations. His last years showed not the audacity of youth, but the weight of stewardship, proof that exploration begins history, but legacy preserves it. Vasco da Gama had crossed oceans, broken barriers, reshaped trade, and carved Europe's path into the Indian Ocean. In his final voyage, he ensured that path remained open. The sea had carried him to glory, then back to responsibility, and in the end, he left the world changed on both shores. Vasco da Gama's final days unfolded quietly along the humid coastline of Cochin in December 1524, far from the royal courts of Lisbon and the harbors that once thundered with celebration for his return. Illness had weakened him, and the man who once commanded seas with certainty now lay confined to a chamber overlooking the very waters that defined his life. The air carried the scent of spice and monsoon rain, reminders of the world he had opened to Europe, a world he fought fiercely to control. Surrounded by clerics, administrators, and the distant echo of harbor bells, da Gama's life ebbed like a tide withdrawing from the shore. He died on Christmas Eve, a symbolic closure for a Christian navigator whose voyages reshaped the contact between continents. His death did not diminish the magnitude of his impact. The Portuguese buried him first in Cochin, yet even in rest he remained a traveler. His remains were later transported to Portugal, mirroring the routes he carved through ocean and empire. His body returned to Lisbon as a relic of a new age, an age in which oceans connected rather than divided civilizations. Monuments would soon rise in his honor, cities would bear his name, and his journeys would be retold as the moment Europe broke beyond its medieval boundaries. In Portugal, he was remembered not only as a sailor, but as the architect of a global pathway, a figure who turned the ocean into a bridge of commerce, conflict, exchange, and ambition. Da Gama's legacy radiated across continents far beyond his lifetime. The sea route to India dismantled the Venetian and Arab monopolies that once controlled the spice trade, shifting the axis of global power from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. Portuguese forts, trading houses, and naval patrols soon dotted the coastlines of Africa, India, and beyond. Spices flowed into Lisbon in quantities unimaginable before da Gama's voyage, enriching the kingdom and inspiring other European powers, Spain, the Netherlands, England, to chase their own routes across unknown waters. Exploration ceased to be myth and became a geopolitically engineered system. Mapped, financed, militarized. The age of discoveries, for better and worse, accelerated under his wake. Yet his legacy is twofold, triumph and turbulence intertwined. Vasco da Gama is celebrated for connecting worlds, but also remembered for the violence that accompanied that connection. Trade became empire, diplomacy became gunfire, routes became corridors of conquest. His name symbolizes both the opening of global exchange and the beginning of European colonial dominance over ancient Eastern markets. In this duality lies the true scale of his legacy. A man who bridged continents and altered history's current. Vasco da Gama died in Cochin, but the world he set in motion continued to sail forward, reshaping economies, borders, and the very meaning of exploration for centuries to come.